Hola, chicas y compañeros, and welcome to a discussion about British Romanticism. These discussions all fall in the context of the Colorado State University Global Campus course on British Romanticism. And always I start these videos off talking about why this program matters and how the particular course in our particular discussion fits into the bigger picture. Because as students work to go through these courses and this program at CSU Global, it's always important, I think, to remember the bigger vision. So, British Romanticism is part of that 6-course series that will grant those who complete the whole process a certificate in teaching dual enrollment to high school students. And again, those high school students are going through their life, taking regular high school courses, and with a teacher who has the certification, they have the opportunity to enroll in a composition, in a literature course that can be counted for college credit. The agency that gives that young person is dynamic, as I say consistently, but I think it also really kind of assumes this idea that this young person has a space at the table in American higher education, whether it's a community college, a university, wherever they may choose to go. So really important work that students in these courses are doing. And for students in this course, Chicas y Compañeros, we celebrate you. It is very difficult to move on with your professional life that is so harried. Working in America's K through 12 education system is very difficult. It's no walk in the park being an online instructor either. It takes a lot of time and a lot of focus. We're all driven by this intrinsic need to learn and then to share and then to learn from our students. That's what brings us here. Trying to manage a private life, trying to keep your professional life going, and trying to live in your profession is very challenging. And so, as we get started, once again, I celebrate all involved in the process of the CSU Global Campus and these courses, and celebrate the real potential of British Romanticism, because it's a course that can be easily overlooked, is often discussed as something that should be dismissed because it's British, it's Romanticism. There are more and more women coming to the table, but primarily, much like things from the past in the West, it's white males who drive what the tradition will be and why those tradition matters. And it's so let's begin with talking about that. Why is that? Because they're the ones who learn to read and write. And they're white males of a very specific class. The guy who's making shoes all day and learning to be a cobbler's apprentice maybe has a little literacy by this point, but the need to read and write and think and consider text is not a part of who that particularly white male would be in the culture, and that's the truth of the past. And so as we begin working with British Romanticism, I would offer that it's always important to share with students and with anyone you're working with the reality of the times, and maybe to explain the reasoning behind it, right? The reasoning behind why only certain people read and wrote, only certain people were writing and being published. And then again, to get to that idea of audience and who was reading these texts. And then that opens the door to who was maybe censoring these texts and who would have been angered by these texts. Because certainly in British Romanticism, with some of our key thinkers in this class, the idea of revolt is so important that the course even begins there. So as we talk about it, typically in the class, I do share, there's a great BBC, British Broadcasting Company series. One of the sections is called Revolt, but they do go all the way through the British Romantic period, and it's free on YouTube. So if you're working with students or if you're just watching maybe this video to learn a little bit more about the concept and the time and the process, really encourage you to hit YouTube, type in BBC British Romantics Revolt, and it pulls up a really, I think, well done. Of course, I'm a BBC person and a big fan of their documentaries and the way that they shoot things, full disclosure. But there's a really good context set in that BBC piece on revolt about the larger things that were going on. And I think in British Romanticism in particular, it is important to set the context of the time. Why were people angry? And some of those ideas about who was writing and who their audience were will help you unearth and locate those ideas. So as you start to work with British Romanticism, yes, there are some lovely, dreamy things that we see on TV where the woman and the guy get all dressed up in these beautiful fashions and they go out and do all these fantastic things. And we see all these wonderful new narratives taking place that are all over network and pay services like Netflix, right? I think Bridgerton is a super example, right? In following in that tradition of Hamilton, we see kind of a retelling where they take maybe a myth from history. Is it true or isn't it true that this woman existed? I won't go into too many details because it's worth a watch for the clothes alone, and so no spoiler alerts necessary. But they take a myth in history and kind of do a retelling in using methods that a new historicist would have a field day with. And if you want to learn more on new historicism, you can always go to cleverchicas.com and check out the critical theory video where I talk a little bit more about that. But British Romanticism always captures our imagination. And my point behind what may have seemed a little bit like a meander, trust me, it's not, is this idea that as history has taken over British Romanticism and really grabbed on to a few of the writers, we tend to focus on that romanticism piece, and a lot of the texts that people retell focus on the romantic because people like it. That's what sells, that's what draws us in, and that's not a bad thing. We can learn a lot about what people dress like and what they ate and what they looked like and when they showered and what their hair looked like and all those kinds of things by grabbing onto that romanticism piece. We also learn about how they felt about some of the commonplaces in the culture by looking at who ends up rewarded, who gets married, who gets punished, what people thought of the church. All those kinds of ideals are shown there. But I'll argue with you, and what I think this course really, really shows well is that there's a whole lot more going on than the boy gets the girl or the girl doesn't get the guy, all these kinds of issues. And so some of the key issues I want you to think about in the British Romanticism course, and as you learn about British Romanticism, teach with it, and work with young people, are these ideas. Revolt, the idea of revolt, and the promise of change, the potential that change could come, the potential that there could be this groundswell and things could be different. That's a real part of some of the key writers of this period. So that's a key theme. Females. Women have a huge voice in British Romanticism, and a simple Google of women, British Romanticism, key writers will pull up some of those names. And what's really exciting is that if you look through some of the scholarly journals that many that you can access, at least an abstract online, you'll see that in the last 20 years, there has been really exciting scholarship. So yes, you can go back and find some in the 50s and 60s, but what's really interesting is that you can also find some from the 2010s forward that puts these women and their ideals and their ideas and their motives in a new context. There's some great romantic relationships between some of the women who wrote in this period and some of the leading men. And so there's all these kinds of really juicy conversations on, did the guy who was the famous writer of the period influence her, or did she really influence him? And so there's all kind of like intrigue and things like that that you can share with your students as we work to uncover and unearth more about British Romanticism than excitement on the moors or intrigue and love on the moors. So the idea of women, their voices, their role, and their place in what the form of romanticism looks like, revolt, females, and then another idea that I think is so important and that this course talks about so well is that these folks really were the first echo critics. So as someone who lives in Florida, I think of people like Ernest Hemingway and Carl Hiaasen as being these great echo critics. And by echo critics, I mean ecological. They're worried about the environment being destroyed. And so I do a lot of work with Ernest Hemingway. You'll see my Florida Hemingway Society poster in the background and really connect a lot with Ernest Hemingway and his work in Florida and Cuba. And very early on, he's concerned that tourists are coming in and destroying the paradise they're coming to see. The Sights of Whitehead Street that he wrote for Esquire magazine is a good example of that. The Sights of Whitehead Street, Ernest Hemingway, if you want to Google it, full text and free. And then Carl Hiaasen, who you may know him for writing Double Whammy or Hoot or some of those kind of books, who writes for in Miami and is a journalist there, really kind of continues that tradition. So we know that idea in America that he comes in and says, wow, tourists are coming down here to love everything, and yet they're destroying it. Well, I'm going to argue in this class and in the study of British Romanticism that those romantics were worried about it in very similar and significant ways. So this idea that our modern folks who are like, hold on a minute, we've got to worry about the environment, and that literature and culture talks about it. The British Romantics were doing it too, and it's often overlooked, and this course really talks about it in a nice and significant way. And more scholarship is coming out really over the last 15 years on the ecocritical nature of the British Romantics. So these ideas, and you see it, when I was a little kid, there was this golden book, The Country Mouse and the City Mouse. And I loved the little picture. It had a little pink background, and the little country mouse is driving in a little car, and darling, right? But that image and that idea has been in American culture for a long time, even in children's books, of what happens when the country mouse goes to the city or the city mouse goes to the country, right? The British Romantics are all over that. And so many of the ideas that we think about when we imagine those little golden books, or we imagine those stories where you take those commonplaces, to link back to some of those kind of ideas from ancient rhetoric, where you take that commonplace of what happens when country and city meet and collide. The British Romantics really play with that tool and that trope so well, because it was so much a part of their life. You are really seeing industry change what birds look like. Birds that were white are now making adaptations to live and survive in camouflage because soot falls on them. And so now maybe they're dappled. I mean, all these kinds of things are really happening in this period. Industrialization is polluting rivers that were once gorgeous, that people depended on for food. All these kinds of things are really starting to happen in what will become the conflict and unrest of the Industrial Revolution. And the British Romantics see it, and they're worried about it. They're worried about all these ideas. And again, remember, our first theme is revolt. Women are getting a voice. They're having interplay with the traditions of literature and art of the men who are defining British Romanticism. And then you have this eco-critical approach and this eco-critical lens that I really encourage you to look at, because I think if we do that, we can enjoy still all the romance and all the things that as a culture we've come to love and identify with for the British Romantics, but we can also dive in a little bit deeper and see that they were more than groovy velvet clothes and forbidden romance. So as you move forward, and as you think about the British Romantics, remember that while they were primarily white, primarily male, with some female voices moving in, their traditions and their ideas and their ideals carry forward to the now very open and very vast canon of writers and speakers all over the world. And as you're working with your students, a great exercise is to ask them to think, where have I seen these ideas of revolt in the way they were thought about from that period forward, of new voices entering in conversation and playing with them the way that male and female writers do here. And of course, that eco-critical piece is all around us. Think of all the young people who are so actively involved in changing about how we think about our culture through song, through art, through dance, and through literature. And you'll find your pathway into these British Romantics who had a little bit more going on than love in the afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening. And for more on any of the topics covered in the CSU Global Classrooms, check out cleverchica.com. You'll find out at cleverchicas.com under the resources page, the CSU Global link has all the videos shared. Thank you, and be well.